Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias a todos.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. I'm really excited about this event because I would be like a great fan, and this is what I'm doing right now. As soon as I got here and when I introduced, I met Lucy, because I think that it's a great time to listen to one of the most important voices, because I think that Lucy Sante's case, I would say that it's a rediscovery for me. I've read Kill All Your Darlings, and some other books that are the ones that have introduced Lucy Sante's work in Spain. And by then, Kill Your Darlings was amazing for me. And when I read Maybe the People Will Be the Times, it's like, well, I just wanted to mark the whole book, and I would like to take pictures from the cell phone to send to my colleagues, etc. But, well, I think that we all do that. And in order to, taking advantage of this opportunity, by then it's the first time that you're here, Lucy, right?
Okay.
Is it?
In Madrid?
Yeah. My first time in Madrid? No, it's my second time in Madrid, actually.
Second time. Yes. Ya. Bueno, pues vamos a aprovechar que tenemos a Lucy aquí y...
So let's take advantage of this opportunity that we have Lucy here. And I just want to get started by saying that in Maybe the People Will Be the Times, that's a very interesting thing. And I have the feeling that when I read Lucy, I imagine like a detective at a crime scene. The crime scene is our cultural scene, and in some way, for me, this is what I wanted to ask you. There's an idea that I think that appears on many of your articles, your texts, and this is the point that objects, books, pictures, these are objects that express this idea that crime is never perfect, that there are always fingerprints that we can find in the past through objects. Because I read your articles, your texts, and I constantly see that vindication, the fact that these objects, the tactile world, we're at a time where we think that we are losing things from our hands. Objects prove that the past is never past. It is still present because it is the objects, right?
I have a very great deal of difficulty hearing the translation, so if you could say something in English quickly to resume, because I'm a bit deaf, and the two are not colliding. You see what I mean? When you speak, I hear your voice and the translation at the same time, so that's okay. Whoopsie. Yeah, that would be better. Thank you. So I'm sorry, I missed that question.
Vale, ya te entiendo. Vale.
Yeah, I get it now. Okay. My question was, your work. I mean, I see your work as like a detective. For example, I think that everything that has to do with true crime is very interesting for you, or even the pictures at the crime scene. But I think that there's an intention, or that's my opinion, to vindicate the fact that the objects are always there, no matter they're books, pictures, LPs. I mean, for example, when you live in New York and you go out to find the objects left by people out of their houses, and a very funny object is when this stops happening, because it has a lot of value. You didn't take it from the trash, from the street, but suddenly you became like a collector. I mean, the objects, the fact that the object is there proves that past is never past. It's always present, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's I tell the story of finding a card of a beauty parlor on a intersection in New York City, which was at that time the biggest heroin market, and the idea of there being a beauty parlor in this place where there's a heroin market just seemed, and so having, I once lived on an old farm, and I don't know how it is in other countries, it's probably the same. In America, in an old farm, before current consumer culture, any product that couldn't be used again would be buried. And what happens is that after 60, 80, 100 years, these things come back. And it's a bit like that with the city. It's like the time regurgitates itself, and it's random. I love the fact that it's completely random, and you have to, and it tells you the story of the place as a consequence of reemerging.
Claro. Es curioso porque
Now, it's funny because we're always told that paper, for example, now we are presenting maybe the people will be the times, the paper, the books is something that will disappear. It's something that we've been listening for many decades, I would say. But it's not the case. And eventually, objects have a grave responsibility. Objects, in a way, that has to do with crime. I mean, they discover us. The objects will always be there, right?
Well, some of them will. That's the great sorting function of time. That some objects survive and others disappear, and just like the way that stories of particular lives will endure and others will fade, and crime. To bring it back to crime, one of the things that interests me about crime, I mean, there's a lot about crime that's just I'm not interested in, but I like the randomness. I like the way that when there's a crime scene, you see the belongings of the person, you see the photographs, and you would not have access to those lives if it were not for that. And they are these little slices, and very powerfully impregnated with the stuff of a life.
Hay una frase,
There's a sentence as you start an article that appears at Maybe the People, or would be the Times. It's not Kill All Your Darlings, that is the first book published in Spanish, is why did you think that I call it dope? And it starts by saying we need to take past into account. It's not dead, but sometimes it can get up and it can bite your ankle. It's an approximate translation. We don't have the book here, okay? So that's amazing.
¿Recuerdas ese?
Do you remember that paragraph? Do you remember the moment when you wrote it?
Yeah, I do. And I guess I was probably thinking in the back of my head, there's a famous quote from William Faulkner, who said, the past, he was talking about the southern states of the United States, the past isn't past, the past is not dead, it's not even past yet. I mean, we need that historical distance, because assuming human culture doesn't get zapped within the next 50, 100 years, distant ancestors will lump us together with the invention of the telephone and the discovery of America and everything else, because time is so long and lives are so short, so that the past really is just like there, it's right there.
Claro. Lucy, ¿tú cuándo escribes?
Lucy, when you write, when you leave those memories, that statement, so to speak, I have the feeling that when you write, you go towards a self story, so to speak, to your intimate memories. Do you feel in some way that you have to be quick when telling what has happened, because it will vanish in the haze? Because I have this feeling when I read you that the time's almost up.
The time is stuck. Yeah, I mean, I guess there is a certain sense of urgency, I mean, when I think of how much life has changed just in the course of my life, how much is forgotten, how much I have to, every year, I taught for 27 years, I just retired, and every year I'd have to learn what students knew of the past, because it would be different from what students 5 years before knew of the past. It's constantly shifting. And similarly, I mean, I just find it to be my responsibility, my mission to be the chronicler of my own times. You know, I'm not as a journalist, not as a reporter, but a chronicler of the emotions, the subjectivity of my time, and as I've seen it over almost 7 decades.
7 décadas, claro, sí, sí.
Well, 7 decades, yeah. There's an article, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was reading one of the articles that appears on Maybe the People Would Be the Times, I remember that legendary Ratman. I read it and I felt anguished because every paragraph starts by saying, I remember this, I remember that, I remember whatever. And maybe I'm wrong, but that reminded me of the attempt. I mean, someone that is going to lose his or her memory. Someone that says suddenly, well, I need to write this down because maybe I won't remember this tomorrow.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. It's actually also an allusion to a very famous book called I Remember by an American poet named Joe Brainerd, in which he remembers things in no order. These are all about movies, right? Because it was incidental. I was asked to write this for a movie theater, but yeah, I mean, who else, you know, I mean, if I don't write it down, who else will remember the Ratman of Paris? And who else will remember audiences talking back to the screen, which, you know, there aren't even very many movie theaters anymore, but audiences talking back to the screen is something that I don't think happens anymore anywhere.
Quizás es lo mismo que sientes.
Maybe this is the same that you feel for pictures, for example, anonymous people, people from the street. I mean, there's a comparison that I think is really interesting, and it's about the medium, the psychic pictures, for example. What we can find there is a part of, it's a matter of game too, because it was fake, right? But it was there, it was impregnated there. I mean, the attempt, I think it's a lost attempt, because this is capturing the past that is gone. But anyway, we need to state that, right?
Yeah, photography, did I understand that right? Photography preserves a slice of, and that's something amazing that, you know, we didn't have until 1839. And to me, there's always a little bit of a frustration that here I have this window into the past, but I can't go in. I can't, you know, my way is barred on either side. So it's just that, and sometimes it's a great mystery, and we don't know, especially with anonymous photographs of the past. I mean, what does this mean? And sometimes we will never know. Sometimes detective work is required to bring out the full context, but you know. I don't know if I answered your question or not. But.
Sí. Mejor aún.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And regarding pictures, what pictures are more interesting for you? The ones where you can find information about the people that are on the picture, or the fact of building an imaginary tale about the people that appear on that picture? What is more interesting for you?
You know, I don't tend to build imaginary tales about, I don't. I mean, I'm really interested in photography as truth. I mean, of course, I could say, this. Look at this person in this photograph, he probably has stomach problems, and you can't hear out of his left ear like me. But really, I'm more interested in trying to find everything about the truth that I can from this. So it's a window into the past. And also, you know, when I find photographs, I'm judging on two criteria. One is aesthetic. You know, as a photograph. It can't be it can be a bad photograph, but it's got to be a photograph that hits me emotionally. And the other is how much socio-historical information it conveys.
Es curioso que emplees.
It's funny that you use the word true, that the photography, that picture expresses a truth. I mean, that's important. We are living at a time of relativism where it seems that the truth does not exist, not even history. I think that it's the other way around. We need to say that history exists, and it existed, and the truth, of course, it exists. And photography gives us away. I mean, it expresses this truth. If you allow me, I'm going to read a paragraph of the book. It's an amazing page. When I told you that I was sending pictures, I'm going to take this off. When I said that I was sending pictures of this, and I was astonished because there are moments that are amazing. And in fact, I sent pictures via WhatsApp because deeply I'm really jealous. I mean, when I read people that write so good, I think that is amazing. So how is it possible to write this? Sorry for the translation. Okay, so we don't have the book. She had a small body whose axis was like if she was on an engine, and on his waist she was just glimpsing. She didn't have any dancing card. So as a whole, it was like music. She had the powerful of the bass guitar and the guitar of broken glass and the moaning melody. As a child, we were living in a younghood where everything is amazing, final, one day or another, and at a provisional time that was subject to preventive revision. We broke and we reconciled ourselves once and again. We lived together, or we lived at opposite extremes of the island, until she moved to the west and she didn't come back. And he went there, but he preferred not to stay there. Then her body betrayed her. First of all, she became allergic to TV. After that, to TV when it was off. After that, to inactive TVs or from her neighbors. After that, the recent manufactured objects stimulate as different that it became like the Levitic book. Her muscles gave up and she was unable to dance. She couldn't walk. She couldn't talk. And eventually she became into a head joined to a body that was absolutely useless before she stopped to be able to eat and to breathe. And I was reading this while I was having a coffee next to the river here in Madrid, and that spoiled my morning, by the way. But it's amazing, absolutely amazing. Lucy, maybe I'm wrong, but there's a tradition, especially from non-fiction writers. I think that there's a misunderstanding in Spain and Europe with the US, because there's a tradition in US of non-fiction writers, for example, Grail Marcus, the one that tells an amazing anecdote at the prologue of the book, and I would like you to tell us about it. That moment when, well, he explains that at the beginning, there's some kind of writers' meeting or something, and you were invited to take the floor. Your theory about when blues started, when blues was invented, I think that it's an amazing theory. It was invented at a specific time, on a specific day, in a specific year. There's a person that was the first one that plays blues, and this is what happens. And Grail Marcus says that everybody was amazed. There was a big round of applause when you ended up with reading that. But I think that there's a tradition of non-fiction writers that when you read about them, they are novelists. I mean, they are non-fiction writers that are writing fiction, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the fact is that for me, I started as a poet, and my lines got longer and longer until they turned into prose. And fiction is something I've taken on every once in a while. I mean, there's quite a bit of fiction in there, not all of it obvious, but but nonfiction writers who use nonfiction to go beyond merely academic or journalistic practice, yeah, there's a current of that which begins in the 19th century. There's French writer. I don't know about, honestly can't think of a Spanish writer who does that, but because I don't know enough about Spanish literature, I'm sorry to say. But in French and British and American literature, there's antecedents for this. And I think it's something that's happening more and more. And, you know, for that matter, fiction and nonfiction, I'm saying this because I'm reading a French writer named Emmanuel Carrère right now, and you know, fiction and nonfiction are sort of trading places, or they're miscegenating, which is this is going to drive the translator crazy because I don't know how. Anyway, they're having bastard children together, fiction and nonfiction.
No, entendido totalmente.
Yeah, totally understood. I can't help asking you. I mean, I didn't want to ask you. Didn't want to go to the anecdote, but it's unavoidable when I read on the book that suddenly you moved. I mean, you live in many houses. You are in permanent movement, but suddenly your neighbor was Alan Gisbert, right? Alan Gisbert. Yeah. And by the way, he knocks at the door, saying to lower the volume of the music, and that's like, imagine you find Alan Gisbert saying, "Hey, put that music down, please," and there was some kind of diaspora, many fans that went to the building where Alan Gisbert was living because they knew that. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? Was he a good neighbor?
He was a fine neighbor. He really was. He was sort of the father of the building, and this particular building was, you know, a wreck like all these buildings were. He moved in with his partner Peter Orlovsky in the early 1970s, and then all these poets started moving in, and the building, when I was living there, and beginning in the late 70s and all the way until the early 90s, was poets, musicians, poets and musicians primarily, actually, because they were all drawn there by Alan, because Alan was the father, the great guru, really of two generations. I mean, from the 50s until he died in the 90s, he was somebody we looked to for advice and enlightenment, and sought his good opinion.
Lucy,
Lucy, the article that you write about Patti Smith, I think it's beautiful, because a lot has been said and written about Patti Smith. And I know that she follows you. I mean, I love to watch to watch things on Instagram, and I love Patti Smith's Instagram. This is Patti Smith, and it's a picture of her. But there's a great tenderness, I would say, when you write about Patti Smith, because what we've read once and again about Patti Smith is the heroic part in some way, but there's a time, the portrait you do about her, that was really beautiful, I would say, because you suddenly say, Patti Smith suddenly did what anybody could expect. She retires from music, she was a mother, and she married the DMC5. And had you already met Patti Smith? Have you had a direct contact with her? Or it was just, can you please tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I haven't known Patti for all that long. I met her maybe 10 years ago. I know her slightly. I first saw her, though, I first saw her almost 50 years ago. Because I read about her. I was a teenager and I read about her in Rolling Stone in like 1971. And first opportunity I had to see her perform, I had to see her because it was rock and roll and it was poetry. And, you know, there was rock and roll and poetry lyrics in rock and roll, but that wasn't quite the same thing as poetry that expressed rock and roll. So to me, she was a great heroine. And not only that, when I saw her, it was a key moment in my life, which didn't have a denouement until recently, because I realized my profound identification with women. She was the conduit. She's absolutely the first person. I didn't have sisters. She was the first person I realized, we're of the same essence, really. So I followed her across the decades. She's been even though I in life don't know her that well, she's been a constant companion of mine.
Ella, sabes que ella es súper fan de...
Well, you know that she's a great fan of William Blake. I also love William Blake. And sometimes English writers have the possibility of building their own universe through their own tradition, right? I think of Albion, William Blake. In your work, I think that there's a great interest by French culture. I have that feeling. And in fact, you've said before that you were, I don't know if reading or writing about a French writer. Could you please tell us about your universe, your supporting universe when you started to write? I mean, what tradition? A US tradition, a French tradition, British tradition?
Yeah, the French tradition and the American tradition arrived in my life almost simultaneously. I have very, very little British in me, culturally. Just Blake, actually, and Shakespeare, J.G. Ballard. But the English bourgeois novel, not so much. But the American, which is very, there is no high or low. I mean, that American, the one that erases differences of class, very important. And then the French tradition, which begins for me with probably Nerval and goes on through Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Lautréamont, and down to the Surrealists, and has analogs in cinema as well, and lasts until maybe the early 80s. That's colossally important to me. And the two happened kind of simultaneously, because I discovered Rimbaud, for example, when I went to the Expo 67, which was when there used to be World's Fairs, and that was the one in Montreal in 1967. I went there with my parents, and I hadn't been in a French bookstore in 5 years or 4 years, but 4 years are very long to a child. And I started leafing through an anthology of poems and came upon Rimbaud. And partly it was the coincidence of the fact that he was born in 1854 in the Ardennes, and I was born in 1954 in the Ardennes. That was part of it. But also, like, just reading the stuff, I couldn't imagine. It just blew my mind. It was psychedelic experience number one in my life. And so, perforce those two, the American, I'm going to say comic book, I don't mean literally, but kind of, the American slang, the American cowboy, sailor, or whatever, on the one hand, and the French visionary on the other.
Muchas veces has comentado de...
Sometimes you've said, you've talked about how important rock and roll was for you, and I'm really jealous because you speak about Tomberlane or Heartbreakers. You mentioned Patti Smith as the materialization of poetry that has become art, or vice versa. And I mean, in fact, your origins are as a poet. Maybe in some way you feel that you're at that place. I mean, a poet that writes narrative, non-fiction in some way.
Yeah, that is how I think of myself. Yeah. In fact, I was trained as a poet, if that has any meaning at all. The only writing courses I ever took, I don't know if they teach writing in higher education here, but in France it doesn't exist. But in America, it's very, people, if you want to be a writer, you go to a writing master's program. This did not exist when I was young. And the only writing courses I ever took were in poetry. I had some very important teachers there. But I just couldn't, I needed long lines. I didn't like these short, I don't know. Anyway, that's how it started. And at the same time, when I was starting to think that I was really a prose writer, even though I was a poet, I was also discovering detective novels, the Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, detective novels of the 30s and 40s with that American grit language. So that was a process that happened to me when I was 20. It was a big revelation.
Lucy, prácticamente toda tu obra.
Really, all your works are some kind of rebuilding of the story of lures and snares of all New York, so to speak, of the low life. In Spain, we used to speak about the culture of dangerous classes. I mean, who were these dangerous classes? Prostitutes, the lumpen, so to speak. Sometimes I feel part of this fascination when we are asked, why are we interested? I mean, among all the possibilities that we have to write about specific moments, specific cultures, why are we interested on the low life? I mean, what can we find there? Maybe the anomalies, the weird things, because, for example, at maybe the people would be the times, and there are two parts of the book. I would say that there's an autobiography of yourself. This is where I find a poet writing fiction. And the final part, that are some articles about people, photographers, crime photographers, many characters, but they have something in common, and this is that they are weird, they are singular in some way. So why are you interested in low life? It seems an easy question, but sometimes the easiest questions have a not obvious answer, I would say.
Well, that's really two questions. Question number one, which is why is it that there are autobiographical, poetic parts, and there's also pieces in there about individual writers, artists, etc. Well, the whole thing is autobiographical because those items about particular artists, poets, etc., they're all people with whom I have some kind of link myself, there's some kind of autobiographical connection for me. That's how I chose the book. It's not obvious to everybody who reads it. Question number two, low life. Well, partly it's that I wanted to give the history of the city from the point of view of the sidewalk, from the point of view of the poor, of the working class. That's my heritage. I'm workers and peasants all the way back, both sides. So I have no bourgeois ancestry whatsoever. So as a result, trying to write the history of the city from that point of view, and if it's not going to be dry archival matter, if it's going to have a story to it, you realize as soon as you start looking into the literature of the past, and I don't mean the great literature, I mean the newspapers, all that para-literature, as they call it in French, the people who become famous, the names you can attach to the existence of poor people in the city, they're criminals, or they're people outside the law. They're sex workers, they're drug dealers. Those are the people who rise above. That's the summit of ambition for people who would not have access to becoming poets or public officials or museum directors. That's the avenue for many, well, it's probably true to this day in many cases, the avenue is crime. It's the avenue, it's the way that poor people can succeed is crime.
Lucy, a partir de ahora, ¿qué?
And Lucy, from now on, what? I mean, after reading this book, maybe the people and the rest of the books that you've published, I mean, you've written a lot of books. So is there anything missing? Anything that you haven't written about? So what have you thought about from now on? Because I have the feeling that you are going towards autobiography a little bit. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about your plans, if there are any.
Well, I'm writing, I have one book coming out this summer which will not interest anybody in Spain because it's about the reservoir system of New York City. But that's because I live up there, and I write about every place I inhabit. And that is, I live in the mountains to the north of the city, and that's where all the reservoirs for the city are. So it's that story, which is dark. But I'm working on I have to under contract 2 books, and one of them is indeed it's my memoir, the narrative of my transition. And number 2, I was contracted years ago, right after Lou Reed died, to write a biography of him. And I said I did not want to write a biography of Lou Reed. I didn't want to write a biography of anybody, really. So I worked it out with my editors that I'm writing a book about the Velvet Underground in the 1960s, which is a book about the band, but it's really a book about New York City in the 60s, which really hasn't been written about. You'd think it's an obvious subject, but not really.
Me encanta.
I love it. Sometimes the portraits of New York that you do, there's an article where you speak about, I think maybe it didn't happen, everything's fiction. There's a car that crashes and suddenly there starts to be a party around. People start to take bottles out, the police arrives, and they suddenly disappear. Despite this look towards the past, when I read you, I see some kind of reivindication of happiness, of joy in some way, although it is from broken characters. I think that there's joy there, and this is at personal level. You are a proof of joy and happiness, because I said this before, I have a look at your Instagram and there are amazing pictures before the transition and you after the transition.
I confess. No, I mean, everybody who knows me at all and has known me for a while says your personality has changed and you smile so much more and you're happier, and yeah, there's absolutely no question about it. I, carrying around, because I've known that I was trans since I was very small, and I repressed it vigorously for a lot of reasons over many years, and it was like, it's like those people who carry around 100-pound goiter, it's like this giant mass of something that I was like carrying around in my arms for all these years, and I finally get to drop it. And it's liberation. It's unbelievable. So whatever else, I mean, just no longer having this poisonous secret dominating my life is fantastic.
Qué maravilla. Yo me iba.
Well, amazing.
Y además esa alegría que...
And this joy, I think, that really betrays you in some way, because some articles are signed and you can see the date beneath. And as you get closer to 2018, 2019, I don't know if this is a matter of, well, this is just for the sake of curiosity, okay? But I don't know if this is a matter of the translator, but suddenly it starts to be female. You're speaking as a female when you talk about yourself because you're Lucy. So as the date as 2019 comes closer, this happens. So this change, I don't know how to ask this. Will this change inspire what you will write in the future, or maybe it has nothing to do with it? Your transition, I mean.
Well, it's interesting that you say that about approaching 20, because it happened in February 2021, and I was as surprised as anybody. I was struck by lightning. But as far as how my transition will influence what I write, I don't know. I have no idea, you know? I mean, I tend to think, well, I'm still interested in the same things I was interested in before, but maybe, I mean, it's only been over a year, right? So I don't know yet. It's a new continent, and I'm just setting foot on the beach, and it looks familiar, but who knows what happens when you go a little farther inland. We'll just have to see.
¿Te ha resultado fácil? ¿Te ha resultado?
So was it easy? Was it difficult, this step that you've made?
Everybody congratulates me on my bravery, but no, it required no bravery at all. It just happened, bang, and then it was all momentum. I had, you know, and I had to recognize it's the truth. I mean, it really is. I mean, I've mentioned the truth before, but I think that's the truth is extremely important to me. And I think that's what writing is, really. No matter what kind of writing you do, I think you have to tell the truth. Even if you have to lie to get at the truth, you're telling the truth. And so this is an expression of truth. I am following the truth, my truth, but not only my truth sounds like I'm making it up. No, it's a truth that is somewhere deep in my psyche, my body, I don't know.
Si dejar paso a...
I don't know, maybe we should give the floor to... We'll start with the Q&A. If you want to ask anything to Lucy, go ahead, don't be shy.
The present and the moment, like you say, el ahora, no?
Mm-hmm.
And as an important thing for the young people. And what do you think is the more difference between your generation and the city you live, the New York you lived, and the present now, of the youth now, and the New York of now?
Many differences. The biggest one, of course, is that everything is so much more expensive and difficult to... No, I mean, it's fundamental, because we could live more or less where we wanted to live. Young people, unless they've got the cash, do not have that option. And also there are many more people, so that, I talk about the scene at CBGB's in 1975, which I do in the book. That whole entire scene was no more than 200 people. Now, today, adjusted for today's population level, that would be more like 2,000 people today, right? At the same time, of course, we didn't have the digital world. It was very hard getting in touch with people. Maybe you try calling them up, but they're on the street and all the telephone booths are broken. And so you go to their house and you knock on the door and you don't know if they're not answering because they're not home or because they're dead. It's a very, very, very different world. And I mean, I know so many young people who I wish I could take them back with me, show them 1974 or whatever. I think it was a more hospitable time, really, because we had more freedom. We had more freedom in terms of things being cheaper, things being more open, things being less policed. At least that was the case in 1974 in New York. Can't guarantee that would have been the case in Madrid. But yeah, it's, you have to realize, my grandfather used to say, every innovation has a counter movement. I mean, in other words, you gain something like digital communications, you lose something, which is that a lot of chance encounters, a lot of, a lot of physical contact. I mean, I think just you don't have that much anymore. So it's always like every generation has its advantages and has its disadvantages. And I'm a kind of nationalist from my generation, I guess. It's sort of embarrassing, but I think everybody does that. But the young people today are amazing. I mean, the people, truly, from teaching and young people I know through social media, I really, 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 really wish Generation Z ran the world right now, because they understand about, the global climate crisis. They understand about all this stuff. And they haven't yet moved into positions to power, so they haven't been poisoned yet. So, yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Hi, Lucy, how are you? Bueno, mi pregunta es un poco...
Well, my question is a little bit about the existence of the counterculture or the underground culture. Right now, in the time that you portrayed, maybe 70s or 60s, there were movements by then. There were some ways of thinking that started at a low level and it emerged to the surface, and that capitalized a different political movement or some movements that protested, etc. I don't know that maybe that we are all a little bit orphans, I would say. We are in front of a great aggressivity by the system, by capitalism, etc. I don't know if you consider that we still have movements that can give us an answer, or that can shelter us, so to speak. I mean, to make the long story short, if there's a culture that could be massive, but it's not for the mass, it's a little bit play on words. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
So let me see if I've got this right. You're asking, you're saying that there's a movement, and does it compare to the counterculture? Is that the question? Because I mean, the counterculture itself was, I kind of think the counterculture, as it's often depicted, is something that happened for a year, maybe less. And there are different eruptions of these things. And, also, another thing to remember about the culture I describe in my book is mostly, my generation, meaning 70s. And that meant, honestly, that we didn't have that strong a political motivation at the time, because the war in Vietnam was over. And I remember just years of not reading the newspaper. And, politics was something that happened on the street corner. I mean, I knew about politics because I knew that my black friends couldn't get a taxi. That was politics. That was on that level. As far as like larger, global or even national stuff, we were not too sharp on that stuff. Because we were complacent, because we could afford to be, referring back to life being inexpensive. And today, young people, need movements. They really do, and you have that opportunity, because that's what the digital realm is good for, is unifying people in a large way across countries, across continents. We didn't have that opportunity at all. So, things spread by word of mouth, and it was a bit like telephone game, when you keep whispering in somebody's ear and then the subject comes out some other way at the other end. You, however, have this instant communication, and you really need to use that to the fullest to, So I don't know if that answered your question. Okay.
Hola.
Hello. Lucy, I would like you to speak a little bit about, if your generation, my generation, baby boomers, or the result of of our generation basically should feel guilty because of the world that we live, or maybe we did our best and the ones that come after, they have to do something, maybe they are not doing anything.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I hear that one a lot. I mean, I gotta say, I've done my best not to contribute to that junk. I've never had any money, so that's one thing. I'm clear there. Yeah, I mean, it is true that, you know, it's so funny to read the self-portrayals of this young generation in the 60s especially, because, you know, they're making proclamations. I mean, we're going to change the world, you know, put hippies in office and everything will be great. And that utterly failed to happen. And some of these same people who are demonstrating in Vietnam or taking LSD at Woodstock, whatever, then entered the ranks of the major corporations and contributed to the misery that we're in now. This, you know, happened again and again and again in every country. I don't know about Spain, but in France, you know, former 68 terres in great corporations doing massive damage. They're common as dirt. Yeah, all I can do is, younger generation, I'm very sorry, you know. I apologize for people who were born around the same time I was.
¿Tenéis otra pregunta?
So, do you have any further questions? Yep, here at the front row. Hello. I wanted to ask you, well, you've been talking about the past without nostalgia. To me, that's a very good thing. That how this generation of yours was, I mean, some of them went into great corporations, they were vanishing a little bit. I don't know if you have felt alone sometimes because of that, because you've kept that commitment with that underground environment. I mean, I don't know if that has made you reinvent yourself in some way, or if it makes you feel alone, and if that's the case, how have you faced that?
Well, I'm not alone. You know, I mean, the fact is that I have quite a number of friends. I have really an amazing number of friends I've known for 50 years, and we all came up through all this together. And you know, they're not all artists. Some of them are. Some are filmmakers, etc. And you know, and I'll meet people who I didn't know back then, and we have this shared, you know, we went through the same war, and so I don't feel in that respect alone at all. I really feel like it's not a generational thing, because I certainly know a lot of people my age with whom I have Zippo in common, but you know, veterans of the Lower East Side in New York City, certainly there's a gang of us, you know. I don't know if that answers your question, Alvaro.
Sí, quería preguntarte una...
Yeah, I wanted to ask you something that has really intrigued me, that you've said before about this book that they asked you about Lou Reed, and it will become into a book of the Velvet Underground of the 60s, because you have said that despite it's a period that has been studied a lot, maybe there's an angle that has not been explained yet, and you think that you can do it. And at the same time, I would say, how can you relate the story with the rest of your work? And if part of what you do is writing about topics that are more or less familiar, for example, funk, and dealing with these topics from a different point of view, and when, in some way, did you discover that you had this capacity to do so?
I'm not sure if I entirely understood that. when did I discover I had the capacity to write about music? I don't know. I guess I very young, I wanted to be a rock critic. I was 14, and I used to send record reviews into Rolling Stone, was a brand new magazine, and again and again they'd say, "We love your piece, we're going to publish it," and then it would come back in the mail. I never got published, and I was, well, okay, that's not so bad. I'm 14 years old. I guess I'll do other things in the future. But anyway, I'd always wanted to write about music, and didn't for many years. So that was advantage number one. I did not become a rock critic. That was really great. Great advantage. Because when I came to writing about music, I realized that the way people write about music was always like, this is influenced by that. And writing about all the cultural, I don't know, writing about, it just evaded the subject, which is nobody wrote about what music sounded like and how it affected people. I felt like, okay, that's the territory that I've got, because I once tried to teach a class in cultural criticism, trying to find examples of writers who'd been to shows and could describe what it sounded like and what effect it had on the audience and what it looked like, and found almost nothing. It was all music writing seemed to be built on something which was built on something else. It was just many times removed from the source. So it's just about being, being honest once again about what's going on. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
No sé si tenéis una pregunta más.
I don't know if you have further questions yet. I think that the mic is not working. Sorry, we have no mic.
Sorry. I would like to know if you're a woman, but you have been read by society as a man, no?
Mm-hmm.
And now that has changed. And how does affect your writing in a good way? If now that you are read as a woman by society, if your writing is changing somehow?
I don't honestly know. As I was saying in answer to another question earlier, it's only been a bit over a year, so I don't have enough information yet. The fact is, I may be the last to know. Other people will tell me, gee, your writing has changed. To me, it'll just be me writing, and I won't even, you know what I mean? I won't have the ability to see for myself from the outside. My now former partner, when I told her I was transitioning, almost the first thing she said was, "Will you start writing fiction now?" And I don't know if I'll start writing fiction, but I know what she means, because my relation to other people has changed tremendously. I used to hide and observe. That was my thing. I was hidden, but I was observing. And now I'm much more out there, still observing. How will that change my writing? That very fact right there. I don't know. It's going to be fascinating to see. Thank you.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you very much for everything you have shared with us this evening. I'd like to know, just a quick question, this being all about your writing, but I'd like to know, who do you read? Which are your favorite authors? What do you like reading? What do you read right now? Thanks.
Wow. That's, this is a question that I could give a different answer to every day. I can tell you who I'm reading, literally reading right now. I'm reading Yoga by Emmanuel Carrère, and I'm reading I Am a Monster Speaking to You by Paul Preciado, who is Spanish, of course. And those are the two books that I'm traveling with in my bag. I read all kinds of stuff. I don't know. I get led from one thing to another. I read systematically when I'm writing something and need to read for it. Otherwise, I like being just aleatory. And, you know, it's like I read crime fiction, but that means really I read 3 crime fiction authors and I don't like any of the rest. You know, it's like that. I read contemporary stuff. I read stuff from the 1950s. I read stuff from the 1850s. And it's all because something is sparked. You know, I've been to a place, I've seen a movie, I've talked to someone, and it pings something in my head, and I'm led to reading this as a consequence. And sometimes that leads somewhere, too.
No sé si no tenemos otra pregunta.
Well, if there are no further questions, well, before... Yeah, there's another question at the back row.
So, sort of a follow-up to the last question. James Ellroy was here yesterday, different writer, but somebody asked him, who did he think had depicted LA the better or the best? So I wanted to know, who do you think has depicted New York the best?
Well, Joseph Mitchell. Joseph Mitchell is my favorite writer about New York. Absolutely, hands down, no question. I don't know if he's been translated here or not. He was a writer from the 1930s to the 1950s who just walked around and got to know people on the street, eccentrics, but even people who weren't especially notable, and would take their stories and make them into great prose. And also telling the stories of people who would just disappear, you know, who'd just been effaced off the historical record. There are many great writers about New York, Walt Whitman, you know, this is where my mind goes blank because there are so many possibilities. You know, there's, what else? I don't know, I just left field thinking about a book, don't know if it's been translated, by Ed Sanders called Tales of Beatnik Glory, which is actually, speaking of New York in the 60s, it's about the bohemia of the very early 1960s. When they're still beatniks. It's before they become hippies. And that's a great book. It's a big fat book, many, many stories. So that's my partial answer.
Bueno, pues...
Okay, so before giving a big round of applause to Lucy, I will read a paragraph, and I think that we are almost done with this. Yes, I'll read a paragraph. And, well, first of all, in order to say thank you for this great opportunity, for sharing her vision with us, and in some way to show this gratitude of generations that have been sharing something, trafficking with something that has to do with the cultural story. Despite we speak about the past, and the best example that it's a present in some way, that all this exists in other way. And sometimes I think that Lucy has used the expression of we need a time distance, so to speak, in order to speak about the past. That time distance, for example, in current times, everything that Lucy says still exists, but sometimes, in our case, we can't judge it because we are too close. But there's a paragraph that is amazing, and the interpreter apologizes because we don't have the book with us, okay? So we'll do our best. So the sun was at the horizon, and they started to describe a fan. Each of the rays was very well defined, almost solid. That was the dawn, as was represented at the anarchist engravings. The creation of a new world. They contemplate in silence the phenomenon. It looks like cruelty, something that is totally for free and that wants to make joke at the couple. It's a representation, the epic and ritual representation of the principle of earth, and this is the end of the couple. They have said that that song is coming from an invisible radio. Sally is going around the roses and she still goes around. It's a circle. She doesn't have any access or exit point. They don't have any influence on the song and they don't have power on the sun. Whatever it is, they will wait and they will end once and again. Thank you very much, Lucy.